Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to talk for a few minutes about this idea of creating shared value that my colleagues have alluded to, and that I think Vale as a company has really made great efforts to embrace. And what I want to talk about is the different role of business in society that I think is emerging. If you go back a couple decades, I think business felt that social and environmental issues didn't matter. They weren't really core to the success of a business. And I think NGOs and government felt that their job was to hold business back, to restrain business from doing too much damage. And that kind of antagonistic relationship was really very strong. I think we moved to a second phase over the last couple decades where business realized that it could act responsibly and still make enough money. And in fact, its reputation, and for extractive industries, the reputation it has with governments, was a business asset, was something that was worth protecting and being responsible in order to do that. And I think we saw NGOs and government begin to shift their role to think about setting the standards of accountability and performance that business was expected to meet, being the kind of neutral arbiter of what was adequate corporate social responsibility. But what Michael Porter and I see emerging today is a very different role. It's a role that says, you know, business can actually help solve social problems. And in doing so, it brings to the table a set of resources that NGOs and governments don't have, because it can create sustainable, financially sustainable solutions that don't require ongoing tax revenue or ongoing philanthropic support. It can bring technology and know-how and access to markets. And it can bring a scale of impact that most NGOs don't have. And so we've begun to think of business not just as a negative, but actually as a positive, actually as a player alongside government and civil society that together can solve social problems. And that really is the vision behind this idea of creating shared value. We talk about creating value, and we really mean this idea of creating economic value and social value out of nothing. Because it is only business that can create wealth. And every other source of revenue in society, charitable contributions, tax revenues that support government, come from the wealth that business has created. You think about an extractive industry, and they can come to a country that has great natural resources and turn those natural resources into wealth. Now, what happens to that wealth is a tremendously important issue. But the fact is, it's the presence of business that creates wealth. And in the same way, we see business creating solutions to social problems, creating new business model innovations that reach low-income populations, that provide opportunity and services that people in emerging markets need, and that people in developed markets need as well. And that is the really exciting vision that Porter and I see. And maybe I'm not doing this right. There we go. So, corresponding to these different views of the role of business in society, how business has treated social issues has changed over the years. Initially, business thought of it just in terms of philanthropy. Wasn't really part of the business. It was off to the side. They gave away money to community causes. That was to be nice. But they didn't really look at the impact they were having, and it wasn't really seen as core to the business. I think what happened in the second stage, the stage where companies are focused on corporate social responsibility and sustainability, is the idea that good citizenship matters, and that the sustainable use of resources matters for the long-term benefit of the business. And as was described earlier, sustainability is really about thinking about preserving resources for the future. But in some ways, even though that's an important message, it's a defensive message. It's a negative message. It's a message about scarcity and about holding back. Those dimensions are true, but it doesn't emphasize the proactive opportunity for business truly to create shared value. And that opportunity for business to create social and economic value together in an integrated way is what we see going forward. And I think the reason that companies didn't see this for many years is that classical economics really taught us wrong. Classical economics taught us that environmental and social issues were externalities. They didn't have an impact on the business unless some law or regulation required that you had to pay for them, unless they were somehow priced. But the reality is, as we are seeing companies wake up today to the notion that these externalities really do have internal costs, that these costs are huge. Walmart, for example, the major US retailer, has in recent years taken great steps to reduce their energy usage. They've rerouted their trucks to reduce gas consumption. They've changed how goods are packaged. They've changed how their stores are lit and heated. The result is that they're saving $3 billion in cost over the next 5 years. That's a real sizable internal cost. I was having a conversation a couple weeks ago with someone from Intercontinental Hotels Group, and he was saying, you know, in the hotel business, we look at every detail of every cost. We can tell you how many people have to be at the front desk to handle the volume at any time of the day or night. We can do time studies. Until 5 years ago, we didn't look at our energy consumption. And it turns out energy is our second highest cost. Business has missed huge opportunities to save money and to make money by ignoring what we thought were externalities. And so what Porter and I tried to emphasize in our thinking about shared value is that the long-term competitiveness of companies depends on social conditions. You cannot have a successful company in a failed society. You cannot have a successful business without an educated and skilled workforce, without safe working conditions, without sustainable use of natural resources, and without a flourishing local economy. And so business, for its success, depends on its ability to build strong economic base in the communities where it operates. At the same time, companies can create scalable and sustainable solutions to social problems in the way that governments and NGOs cannot. I was just at the Global Compact conference here yesterday and heard a wonderful example of a company from India, Mahindra & Mahindra, which they work with farmers, they sell tractors, and they realized that many of the farmers they dealt with, very poor farmers, had no adequate housing. They talked about one woman who came up to this man from Mahindra and said, you know, every time it rains, I cry because I don't have an adequate roof, and my children get wet, and I'm worried that they will get sick, and I have no health care, and I can't afford to treat them. And if they get sick, I'm worried they might die. And Mahindra decided maybe there was a business opportunity in providing the financing for these small farmers to build homes, to create mortgages, but a different kind of mortgage than what we think about. Mortgages where the average cost, the average amount of the mortgage is only about $2,000. Mortgages where there's no paperwork for anybody to fill out about their income because these people don't have any reliable way of predicting their income. And so to approve someone for a mortgage, you actually have to go to their home. You have to go look at their farm. You have to go talk to their family. You have to understand whether this is a person who works hard and can pay back. It's a mortgage that doesn't have to be paid monthly, but may only be paid a couple times a year because when the harvest comes is when people have the money to pay. It's a mortgage that has to be extended additional years if there's a drought, because in that year the farmer can't pay. It's a mortgage model that is completely different from traditional banking, and yet it is providing a solution for thousands of farmers who could not otherwise afford housing. Porter and I believe that incorporating the social and environmental impacts into corporate strategy, into the key decisions that a company makes, not on the periphery, but into its key strategic decisions, is the biggest change that will happen in management thinking in the coming 2 decades. So we don't think that this is a small idea at all. So you've heard the definition of shared value: policies and practices that contribute to competitive advantage and economic benefit of the company at the same time as they advance social and economic conditions in the regions where they operate. You know, as Michael and I have been out talking about this, we realize people have sometimes misunderstood what we mean. And so we've had to talk about not only what shared value is, but what shared value is not. And so it's not about sharing the value that's already been created. It's not about redistribution of wealth. It's also not about personal values. You heard this morning about the importance of ethics, and ethics are important, and strong personal values are essential for good managers. But this is not about the business having the same values as the community. The reality is they have different values. And it's not about balancing the interests of stakeholders against the interests of the company. Listening to stakeholders is very important. But this is about creating new value that wasn't there before. And Porter and I believe that not all profit is equal. Because a company that is exploiting resources for the short term, that is not building a strong community, that is not thinking about the environmental and social impacts of its business, is a company that does not have great long-term prospects. And one of the nice things, as Lisa's mentioned, is that extractive companies, mining companies, do have a very long time horizon. And there's an opportunity for them to really reap the benefit of the investment they make in the communities. And so we're, in our thinking, turning on its head some of the conventional wisdom, thinking about not saying what's good for business is good for society, but saying the opposite. What's good for society is actually good for business. And I think we used an example in the article of fair trade. And this has been a very controversial example because we've said fair trade is a good thing, but it's not scalable and it's not sustainable. Fair trade involves sharing the value that's already created. It involves taking a little bit more of the purchase price of the commodity and giving it to the farmer. And that's a good thing, and the farmer needs the money. But a shared value approach would be to say, let's actually work with the farmer and the entire agricultural chain and the government in that region to increase productivity and yield. We've been working with cocoa farmers in Côte d'Ivoire, and about half the world's chocolate comes from Côte d'Ivoire now, tiny country. And the farmers are getting yields that are 1/3 to 1/5 of what they ought to be getting. Now, there's fair trade and NGOs working there, and they are helping, and they're providing some community services. But Mars, the candy company that brought us in to work on this, realized that the sustainability of the cocoa crop was a critical business issue. Now, you'd think that would be obvious, but the fact is they hadn't really thought about it before. They simply bought cocoa as a commodity on the open market. They didn't think how it was grown was really any of their business. But what they've come to realize is that they can have a transformative effect by working with farmers, because again, they bring the financing, they bring the know-how, they bring the access to markets, they bring the clout to influence government policy, and to bring other companies to work together to actually train farmers differently, provide different plant material and different farming inputs, and in that way actually triple or quintuple the yield and the income of these farmers, but do it in a sustainable way because it has increased productivity. So when we talk about creating shared value, we talk about it happening at 3 different levels, and I'll just give you quickly a couple examples from each. The first is around reconceiving products and markets. The second is around redefining productivity in the value chain. And the third is around enabling local cluster developments. And we talk about these 3 as separate, but they're very interrelated. When you think about that example of the rural housing that Mahindra & Mahindra created in India, it is a new product and a new market for them, but they had to redefine every activity in their value chain of financing mortgages in order to meet the needs of their very particular market. And they had to actually work in communities so that the people who collected the money, the people who assessed the viability of candidates for loans, were people from the local community. And so they actually had to strengthen the local clusters to accomplish this goal. But let me give you a couple examples of each. Dow Chemical has created new products that help address social problems. One example is what they call solar shingles. Dow realized that putting solar panels on the roof requires expensive trained workers who can install these large panels. Very different than a normal roofer. And a large part of the cost and the limitation on people being able to put solar panels on their houses is the lack of these trained workers. So Dow invented a product that they call solar shingles, that are normal roofing shingles that are photovoltaic, and they actually plug together like little Legos, and any roofer can put them up with a nail gun just as he would any other shingles. It's an incredibly popular product. It's making solar power much more widely accessible. They've created organic pesticides, and they've invested in a company, Water Health International, that has a technology that in India and Africa enables access to clean water for a fraction of a cent per gallon. What I like about Dow's examples is that there's some that fit developed markets, and there's some that fit emerging markets, and there's some that fit both. Here in Brazil, Fibria is a pulp company, one of the world's largest, and they've changed how they do their value chain to take into account the environmental and social impacts, and as a result have developed a better competitive model. They've realized that eucalyptus plants are faster growing, are easy to convert into pulp, and have a much higher yield. But they also realized that if they planted acres and acres of eucalyptus in a monoculture, it would destroy biodiversity, it would deplete the soil, and it would not be sustainable. So they created a mosaic interspersing their eucalyptus plants with ground that they let local farmers use to grow their crops on, and then they can rotate among them. And so there are now almost 4,000 farmers in Brazil who are growing crops that they can eat and sell on land owned by Fibria. and Fibria has achieved a competitive and cost advantage by doing this. Another example here in Brazil, I was over at Coca-Cola headquarters a couple days ago. And of course, Coke is sold all over. It's sold in the favelas. And it's hard to get good retail outlets in the favelas. And so Coke created a program to take youth, age 15 to 25, in the favelas, and to give them just basic training in retailing. And it turns out that the biggest impact they have isn't what the youth learn in retailing, but it's about the youth's self-esteem. The certificate they get at the end of that 8-week course is the first certificate they've ever earned in their life. And it changes how they think about having a career. And so Coke has created this program. They've gone into the communities. They started out working with a large global NGO and realized they couldn't do that. They had to find NGOs in each of the favelas that grew out of that community, run by people who really understood that community. And the teachers in these courses had to be youth who had gone through the course from that community, who could really act as role models. And they very, very carefully monitored both the business impact and the social impact. And on the social impact side, these youth are getting employment when they graduate, and on average, they're increasing their household income by 50%. And on the business side, Coke is getting distribution in areas in favelas where it did not have retail outlets before, and is also being able to measure the brand love. This is how they talk at Coke, brand love, that has been generated as a result of this program. And it's reaching 65,000 youth a year. It's only 3 years old, and they're continuing to expand it. A great example. One more example I want to give you really about building a competitive cluster. And this is back in India. And Novartis, the pharmaceutical company, realized that most of the drugs they were selling in India were being sold in urban areas. And yet 70% of the population lived in rural areas. And when they went out to villages in the rural areas to try and understand why they weren't selling there, they found there were some big problems. The first problem they found was that people didn't have basic health-seeking behavior. They didn't recognize symptoms. They didn't go to a healthcare provider for treatment. And that was probably just as well, because the next thing they found is that 80% of the healthcare providers actually had no medical training at all. And if they did go to a provider and the provider prescribed for them a drug, the odds are if they went to a clinic, they would not actually have the drug in stock. So again, Novartis could have said, well, this is a market failure. This is a place we can't do business. But instead, they said, maybe we can solve these problems. They hired 300 healthcare educators, not salespeople, but people whose job it was to go into the villages, do workshops, teach basic health-seeking behavior. They created 2-week-long training clinics for healthcare providers, and they built a distribution channel to 50,000 local clinics. They actually did a partnership with Vodafone so that if you reported your inventory levels on your cell phone, you got free cell phone minutes. So it was an incentive for the clinic to keep current their inventory levels. The result is that Novartis is now reaching a population of 42 million people that they couldn't reach before. It was a higher investment. It took 3 years to break even. But they've realized they've now created a new business model, and they're trying it in Vietnam, and they're trying it in Kenya, and they're realizing that there will be more people in the world that they can sell to through this business model than through the traditional model that they've been using. Just a couple other points before I conclude. As we've worked with companies and tried to help them think about what's different about shared value from what they've been doing, we've realized that you can think about 4 different quadrants. And you can think about them in terms of the business value and the social impact. So on the bottom left, philanthropy is a good thing to do, and it delivers benefits in a community, but it doesn't necessarily provide a lasting solution to a social problem. And that's the dividing line horizontally. And on the right-hand side, we've seen that business, as usual, provides social benefits. It pays taxes, it pays wages, it provides benefits. But it doesn't necessarily create deliberate solutions to social problems in the ordinary course of business. And so we've begun to help companies think about what are they doing that is business as usual, what are they doing as philanthropy, and what are they doing that's shared value, where they are achieving the business rate of return they want to achieve, that hurdle rate, and at the same time actually solving a social problem. And then there's a category of shared value enhancers, which may not deliver as much business value, may not deliver the same profitability, but which delivers some profitability and helps strengthen the shared value programs. We're seeing that shared value is not just a different way of thinking for companies, but it's really transforming the role of NGOs and government and philanthropy as well, to think about becoming partners in an integrated solution to social problems rather than opposites or enemies. And we've also seen some really interesting conversations with Wall Street, with the investment community. UBS has now asked every one of their 600 analysts to include a paragraph on shared value creation in each of their company write-ups. Investors are beginning to recognize that the way they've thought about sustainability, primarily as a risk, is too limiting, and that what they've missed is the social issues that create new opportunity for growth and profitability by creating shared value for companies. When we think about mining companies, there are some basic issues that they encounter, and Lisa has really described them in greater detail than this and very accurately, but certainly issues around worker productivity, around the local supply chain, around civil unrest. And the traditional response has been to accept that there is a poorly trained workforce with high absenteeism and high turnover, to bear the cost of importing goods and services from outside the region because they couldn't be provided locally, and to donate to community projects in the hopes that that would prevent objections and protests. But none of these really solve the problem. They're just about living with the problem. And as we see companies begin to think about creating shared value, begin to think about how they actually can solve the problem, it's much harder work. It requires a much longer time frame and a much more significant investment. It frankly requires a culture change within the company to think about this as part of the day-to-day business. But it means building a competitive local cluster. It means investing in creating the training institutes, the schools that are necessary to build a skilled local workforce, and the supports for the local businesses that are necessary for them to serve as suppliers to the company. It's about the business taking responsibility for building a competitive economic cluster. So I just want to step back to conclude and emphasize that we really believe that a shared value approach to business is a fundamentally different approach than the traditional model. It's not just about sharing the value created. It's not just about your reputation and being nice. It's about really trying to understand the business results that come from the social impacts you achieve. We're doing a study now at FSG on how to measure shared value creation. And I know there's a panel coming up that will talk about measurement. But and there are indeed many good measurement models out there, such as GRI, Global Reporting Initiative. But what they don't get at is this idea of the link between the business benefit and the social impact. And what we're really trying to understand in measuring shared value is not just measuring social impact, not just measuring business impact, but really understanding the link between the two so that as companies think about developing their strategy, they can think about how to optimize simultaneously the business and social benefit. I am immensely hopeful that companies will embrace this new role, and we've already seen tremendous enthusiasm for this idea from companies around the world. And I'm even more hopeful that when we bring companies to the table to help solve social problems as a partner, using their abilities to create value, to solve social problems, to meet the needs of the poor in this world, that we will achieve more progress for humanity in the coming decade than we have seen in many decades before. Thank you very much for letting me be here with you today.